There are people in this world who have never been told no, not once, not in a way that actually mattered. And somewhere along the line, they stop being human beings and start being something else entirely. Something that looks at the rest of us the way you'd look at furniture. Useful, maybe. Replaceable, certainly. Worth nothing more than the space we take up. I know this because one of those people put his hand on my daughter, and he did it in front of a room full of people who said nothing. My name is Bernard Calloway. I'm 61 years old. I spent 32 years working as a senior building inspector with the city of Ottawa, and I retired 2 years ago to a house in Canada that my wife, Pauline, and I paid off the month before she was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. I tell you that not for sympathy. We're managing. She's doing well, all things considered, but because it matters to the kind of man I am. I am not a man with enemies. I am not a man who looks for trouble. I coached minor hockey for 14 years. I make a decent butter tart. I have never once in my life raised my hand to another person. But I have a daughter named Lily. She is 34 years old, 7 months pregnant with my first grandchild, and she works as a licensed pharmacist at a mid-sized independent pharmacy in the Glebe neighborhood in Ottawa. She has worked there since she finished her degree at Dalhousie. She is, without question, the finest human being I have ever known. And I say that not as her father, but as someone who has watched her give out her personal cell number to elderly patients who have trouble understanding their dosage instructions, who has watched her stay late without complaint when someone is confused or frightened or alone. What happened to her on a Tuesday afternoon in March should never have happened to anywhere. It should never have happened to anyone, but it happened to Lily. And the man who did it walked out of that pharmacy smiling. I want to tell you exactly how it unfolded, because I've gone over it in my head so many times that the details are worn smooth by now, like stones in a riverbed. Lily has been on a modified schedule for the last 2 months of her pregnancy. Her obstetrician recommended she stay off her feet as much as possible after some swelling in her ankles, and the pharmacy owner, a decent man named Mr. Haddad, accommodated her without hesitation. She works Tuesday through Friday, shorter shifts, mostly counter consultations. She wears comfortable shoes. She takes her breaks when she's supposed to. She is, by every measure, taking care of herself and of the baby. That Tuesday the pharmacy was moderately busy. The lunch rush had passed. Lily was at the consultation window near the back of the counter, working through a queue of 3 or 4 people when a man walked in. Not to the queue, not to the drop-off. He walked directly to the front of the line, leaned over the counter, and slapped a prescription down on the surface, so hard that the woman ahead of him flinched. His name, I would later learn, was Chadwick Mercer, 53 years old, founder and principal of Mercer Capital Investments, one of the larger private equity firms based out of Toronto, with an office on Spark Street he used when he was in town for whatever it was men like him do in Ottawa. He had a reputation that preceded him. I'd hear this from several people over the following weeks, as someone who treated waiting as an insult to his time and treated anyone in a service position as an extension of the service itself. Not a person, a function. Lily looked up at him from where she was standing. She was wearing her white coat, her name badge, her reading glasses pushed up on top of her head the way she's done since pharmacy school. She was obviously pregnant. She told him politely that she'd be with him shortly and asked him to take his place in line. He looked at her. Then he looked at the prescription in front of him. Then he looked back at her, and he said, and I'm using his exact words because Lily repeated them to me 3 times and I memorized them. I don't have time for this. I need this filled in the next 10 minutes, or I'm going to make sure this little place gets the kind of review that shuts it down. Lily did not raise her voice. She explained that they were working through the queue as quickly as possible and that she would absolutely help him as soon as she could. He reached across the counter and snapped his fingers in her face. She blinked. She took a small step back. And then, because she took a step back, because she moved slightly out of reach, he leaned further forward and he swatted the back of his hand across her arm. Not hard enough to bruise, hard enough to sting, hard enough that the woman at the counter made a sound, hard enough that Lily's reading glasses fell off the top of her head onto the pharmacy floor. He picked up his prescription, tucked it in his jacket pocket, and said, "I'll take this to Shoppers. At least they know how to run a business." And he walked out. The room was silent for 4 seconds. Lily told me she counted. She bent down and picked up her glasses. Her hands were shaking. She finished helping the woman at the counter. She completed the transaction. She said excuse me to her colleagues, went to the staff room at the back, sat down on the small sofa they keep in there, and she called me. I was in my garage when my phone rang. I'd been reorganizing some shelving, half listening to the radio. When I saw her name on the screen, I answered on the second ring, the way I always do. She didn't cry right away. She started to tell me what happened in her normal voice. Her pharmacist voice, the one she uses when she's being precise and clinical. She got through most of it. She got to the part about the glasses falling on the floor, and then she stopped, and she was quiet for a moment, and she said, "Dad, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do." I sat down on the stool near my workbench. I said, "Lily, are you okay? Is the baby okay?" She said yes. She said she was fine. She said she just needed to hear my voice for a minute. I asked her one question. Just one. "What is his name?" she told me. "Chadwick Mercer." I wrote it down on the back of a hardware receipt that was sitting on my bench. I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket. I told her I loved her. I told her to drink some water. I told her I'd pick her up after her shift if she didn't feel like driving, and she said she'd be all right. After we hung up, I sat in that garage for a long time. I want to be honest about what I felt in those minutes, because I think it matters. I was not calm. I was not measured. My hands were gripped around the edge of that stool, and I was thinking things I am not proud of, the kind of hot and immediate thoughts that come when someone touches your child. I wanted to find him. That's the truth. I wanted to find Chadwick Mercer, and I wanted to stand in front of him, and I wanted him to understand in some very direct and physical way what it means to put your hand on a pregnant woman. But I am 61 years old, and I have spent most of those years watching what happens to men who act on impulse and what happens to the people who love those men when they do. So I sat there until the feeling passed enough that I could think. Then I made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, not to the police, not yet. I called my son-in-law, Nathan, Lily's husband, an aerospace engineer who works at the McDonald Cartier campus. Nathan is 36, quiet, steady, and in possession of a patience that I have always admired and occasionally found baffling. He is the kind of man who thinks before he speaks, sometimes for so long that you've forgotten the question. I told him what happened. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he was silent for a moment, and then he said, "What do you need, Bernard?" I said, "I need to know everything there is to know about Chadwick Mercer." Nathan said he'd make some calls. What came back over the next 48 hours was not surprising, but it was useful. Chadwick Mercer had a history, not a criminal one, at least nothing that had ever resulted in charges, but a pattern. 2 former assistants had left his Toronto firm within 18 months of each other, both of whom had filed HR complaints that were settled quietly and quickly. A restaurant manager in the Byward Market had posted a lengthy review of an incident involving Mercer in 2019, which Mercer's legal team had sent a cease and desist over, and which had been taken down. There were whispers in certain Ottawa business circles, the kind Nathan moved through at industry events, about a man who spent freely, donated publicly, and treated people poorly in the spaces where he believed no one was recording. But there was something else, something that mattered more. Mercer Capital Investments had been, for the past 14 months, operating a real estate fund that had raised approximately $40 million from private investors, many of them retirees, some of them in Ontario, some in Alberta. The fund was called MCI Horizon. It was marketed as a low-risk vehicle focused on commercial property acquisition in secondary Canadian markets. It had a glossy prospectus and a website with photographs of smiling people in offices. Nathan found this because he knew someone who had been approached to invest and who had, to his credit, gotten a second opinion. That second opinion had raised questions that no one at Mercer Capital had been able to answer satisfactorily. Discrepancies between the fund's reported asset values and the public records of the properties it claimed to hold. Capital flows that didn't match the stated investment strategy. and a registered exempt market dealer license that had, Nathan's contact informed us, come up in a quiet referral to the Ontario Securities Commission 6 weeks earlier. Someone had already knocked on that door. I am a retired building inspector. I know nothing about securities law. What I know is how to look at something and identify where the structure is unsound. I called my brother-in-law, Pauline's younger brother, whose name is Ray, and who spent 22 years as an investigator with the Canada Revenue Agency before retiring to Kelowna. Ray is 70 years old and extremely good at two things: cross-country skiing and following money. I told Ray what Nathan had found. I told him about Lily, about what had happened in the pharmacy. Ray listened to the whole thing without comment. Then he said, "Send me everything Nathan has. Give me a week." Ray called back in 5 days. What he had was not by itself a smoking gun, but it was enough. Documentation suggesting that approximately $12 million of the $40 million raised had been commingled with Mercer's personal operating accounts in a way that would be very difficult to explain to regulators. A property in Sudbury, listed in the fund's materials as recently acquired, that public land registry records showed had not, in fact, been acquired at all. It had been under a conditional offer that had collapsed 8 months earlier and was never updated in the fund's documents. And 3 investor statements from people Ray had located through a contact at a retiree investment advocacy group, all of whom had noticed irregularities, and all of whom, when they had called Mercer Capital's Investor Relations line, had been told the discrepancies were clerical and would be corrected. None of them had been corrected. Ray organized everything into a clear, orderly package. He'd spent 22 years preparing files for review. He knew exactly what the Ontario Securities Commission needed and what the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada looks for, and how to present information in a way that makes it easy to act on. Before we filed anything, I called Lily. I explained to her as clearly as I could what we had found. I told her that what Mercer did to her was assault, a flat legal fact, and that we could pursue that separately, and that in my view, we absolutely should. I told her about MCI Horizon and the investors, and what Ray believed was happening. I told her that her father, her husband, and her uncle had spent the past week building something that was going to be very difficult for Chadwick Mercer to walk away from. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you do this because of what he did to me, or because those people deserve to know what's happening to their money?" I thought about that honestly. "Both," I said. "Both matter." She said, "Okay, then do it." We submitted the package to the Ontario Securities Commission's Enforcement Division on a Thursday morning. Ray also sent a parallel submission to FinTrack. I had spoken to a lawyer, a friend of a friend who practiced securities litigation in Toronto, who reviewed everything Ray had compiled and said, plainly, that it was the most organized voluntary disclosure she had received in 11 years of practice. 2 weeks later, an Ottawa-based pharmacist named Lily filed a formal police report documenting the incident at the pharmacy. She described what happened clearly, gave the responding officer Mercer's name, and submitted a written statement. She also filed a complaint with the College of Pharmacists of Ontario, not against herself, but documenting the incident for the record, because her workplace and the safety of people who work in it matter. Mr. Haddad submitted his own statement. 2 of the pharmacy's other employees had witnessed the incident and submitted statements as well. I want to be honest. The criminal process for an assault of this kind, no lasting physical injury, a first-time charge, is slow. It does not move the way you want it to when you're sitting in a garage with a folded hardware receipt in your shirt pocket. The charge was laid. It would be heard. That was the reality. But the other matter moved faster. The OSC does not comment publicly on active investigations. I know this. Ray knows this. We did not expect a press release. What happened instead was this. Approximately 6 weeks after our submission, Mercer Capital Investments issued a notice to its MCI Horizon investors, announcing that the fund was suspending redemptions pending a review by external auditors. The notice was written in the careful, bloodless language of financial crisis management, the language of people trying to say as little as possible about as much as possible. The notice leaked. It always does. A reporter at the Globe and Mail's business desk ran a piece 10 days after the notice surfaced. It was careful, properly sourced, and mentioned that the OSC had confirmed, in the boilerplate way that they do, that Mercer Capital was the subject of regulatory scrutiny. Mercer's legal team issued a statement calling the scrutiny routine and without merit. The statement was 3 paragraphs long and contained no specifics. The Spark Street office closed 2 weeks after the article ran. The Toronto office went quiet around the same time. The website for MCI Horizon began returning a 404 error. I read about all of this on my laptop, sitting at the kitchen table, while Pauline had her morning tea across from me. She knows most of what happened. I told her early, because I don't keep things from her, but she doesn't ask about the details. She trusts me to handle things the right way. She asked me once, around the time the Globe piece ran, whether I felt satisfied. I had to think about it. Satisfied is not quite the right word. Satisfied implies something clean and complete, and this was neither. Lily's assault charge was still working its way through the process. Some number of retirees had money in a fund that was now frozen and would likely be tied up for years. Chadwick Mercer had not yet stood in a courtroom and answered for a single thing. But something had shifted. The thing he had counted on, the invisibility of his behavior, the absolute certainty that nothing he did in that pharmacy or in any other room would ever find its way back to him, that was gone. That I had taken from him. I drove to the Glebe on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after Lily's due date was updated by her obstetrician. Everything on track, healthy, strong heartbeat. I sat in the parking lot of the pharmacy for a few minutes before going in. I'm not sure why exactly. I just wanted to see it. The ordinary small storefront with its green awning and its hours posted in the window and its handwritten sign about flu shots. Lily came out from behind the counter when she saw me. She was enormous by then, 7.5 months, moving carefully in the way that pregnant women do in the home stretch, deliberate, a little amused by their own bodies. She hugged me, or tried to. We laughed about the logistics of it. We sat in the little consultation area near the back, the same chairs where she talks to patients about their prescriptions, and we had bad coffee from the staff room, and she told me about what her week had been like, and I told her about the hockey game I'd watched the night before, and we talked about names for the baby. They're not telling anyone, which I find both aggravating and entirely reasonable. At some point she took my hand and held it for a minute without saying anything. Then she said, "Dad, you know I could have handled it." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm a grown woman." I said, "I know that too." She said, "But I'm glad you didn't let it go." I'm not a man who cries easily. I didn't then, but it was close. There's something I want to say about what happened, and I want to say it plainly, because I've been turning it over long enough that I know what I think. Chadwick Mercer hit my daughter because he has spent his entire life in rooms where no one told him there would be consequences. He is not unique in this. There are people like him in every industry, in every city, in every space, where money and position create enough distance between a person and accountability that they begin to believe the distance is permanent. It is not permanent. What my brother-in-law Ray says, and he says it in the dry, precise way of a man who spent 22 years in government work, is that most of this kind of wrongdoing doesn't get caught because people assume someone else is watching. The regulators assume the investors are paying attention. The investors assume the regulators are paying attention. The employees who see things assume there are whistleblower processes they don't understand. And so the man at the center keeps moving, keeps raising money, keeps walking out of pharmacies smiling. What stops it is someone deciding that it's their problem. My daughter picked her glasses up off the floor and went back to work. She is tougher than I am, honestly, and always has been. But she called her father, and her father wrote down a name on the back of a hardware receipt and didn't throw it away. Chadwick Mercer will face a court date for the assault charge. His fund is under investigation by the OSC and FinTrack. At least $40 million of investor money is the subject of an audit process that, based on what Ray tells me, is unlikely to end well for anyone who touched that money inappropriately. The investors, some of them, at least, have been contacted by regulators and have engaged counsel. There is no version of this story where everything comes out perfectly. That's not how the real world works. Some of those retirees may not recover everything they put in. The legal process will take longer than it should. Mercer has good lawyers and enough money to use them. But there is also no version of this story where Chadwick Mercer gets to be invisible anymore. And somewhere in the next few weeks, my daughter is going to have a baby, my first grandchild, a person who will come into the world with no idea what happened in a pharmacy, in the glebe on a Tuesday in March, or what their grandfather did about it. That's exactly as it should be. I asked Lily a few weeks back what she remembers most from that day. She thought about it for a moment. She said she remembers the 4 seconds of silence, the way the room just stopped, and how she counted the seconds automatically, the way you count anything when you're trying to stay calm. I said, "What did you think about in those 4 seconds?" She said, "I thought about you, actually. I thought about what you'd say." I said, "What would I say?" She smiled and said, "You'd say, 'Pick up your glasses, Lily, then we'll figure out the rest.'" That's about right.